Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of En Route, the podcast where we talk about the journey of life. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, this is a bonus episode, and actually, it's a bonus of a bonus. Um, I had a two-part of a podcast, and decided it probably made more sense for people to just listen to it in one sitting instead of having two separate podcasts to have to go into. So um, I have put together the podcast that was originally called What Happened to Sears Part 1 and 2 into a full one-part um, episode. And this is a part of an interview I did with Warren Shoulberg, a retail journalist. He was kind enough to speak to me about a month and a half ago. And both of us have had a obsession with Sears and Kmart. Actually, what's been going on with Sears and Kmart. And this is an issue that is not well known in the media. Um, Whenever anyone talks about the downfall of Sears, it's usually that Sears didn't keep up with the times. And that is maybe at most 20% of the story. 80% is actually something that we don't normally hear about. So part of the reason I wanted to interview Warren was to really talk to him about this specific topic. And that's what we did a month and a half ago. Um, Today, actually, when I'm recording this, which is September 27th, um, we found out news that the last Kmart in Marshall, Michigan, will be closing. Now, there is some significance to that, and it's not just that that's my home state. Um, Kmart started in Michigan in 1962, um, and actually it had its headquarters in the Detroit suburb of Troy. So seeing the last Kmart in Michigan close is kind of a sad occasion. And there's a reason why these stores are closing. And it's not because of necessarily um, bad business decisions. It's really a tale about greed. So here is this bonus episode. Um, Let me know what you think about it. If you have want to know, share your opinions, send an email to me at denmin@gmail.com. And so that's DEN as in den, as in a room, and then MINN, that's short for Minnesota, and that is all one word, at gmail.com. So now let us hear about what really happened to Sears. Hello, and welcome to Little Jaunts. This is the micro podcast of En Route. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, for over a century, Sears was one of this nation's leading retailers. In the 1920s, you could literally buy a house from Sears. You basically ordered it in the mail order catalog and it came to you. The post-war years saw Sears moving into malls across the land. Kmart started in 1962, the same year that a number of other discount retailers, such as Target and Walmart, also opened for business. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Kmart was the go-to place for finding things at a good price. Shoppers were always on the lookout for their famous blue light specials. In 2005, these two companies merged. Over the last decade, hundreds of their stores were closed, and now the two chains are basically defunct. The common story is that Sears and Kmart didn't keep up with the times, and they pinned the blame on the rise of Amazon. Now, the online retail behemoth does have a role in the demise of Sears. but it's only a small role. Actually, the reason Sears and Kmart have basically vanished from the American retail scene is because of one man, the one time CEO of Sears Holdings, Eddie Lampert. In this two-part episode, we will hear from retail analyst Warren Shoulberg, who has followed Lampert and what he did to Sears. Shoulberg is a longtime expert in all things retail, and he is the right person to talk about what really happened to Sears. Now, this is part of a larger interview I did with Shoulberg on retail in general, and we will show that full episode in a few days. But it's important to hear this story about one retailer and what its downfall says about American society in general. So let's hear from Warren Shoulberg. This is part one. Well, the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the story of and kind of the downfall of Sears. Um, the memory that I have, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, is especially going to Sears that kind of sold everything, and from clothing for school to the lawnmower that we owned. And usually the story that we hear about its downfall has been about Amazon, that it wasn't keeping up with the times, and that's why they are basically not existing anymore. But is that the whole? That doesn't seem to be the whole story. There seems to also be a lot of kind of what kind of started in 2005 with the merger with Kmart and with their CEO. Would you be willing kind of to share a little bit about that story and how that happened?
Sure. So I am a bit obsessed with the Sears and Kmart story. So been following it since I've been following it forever. I've been covering retail for a long time. So first a little context, which is that as recently as the 1980s, Sears was the biggest retailer in America. And as you said, they sold everything, and it's not unfair to say that they were the Amazon of the era. If you wanted something, you went to Sears, either their big catalog or their stores or whatever. And in their earlier days, Sears sold houses, they sold cars, and even in the 1980s, they had a real estate brokerage company, and they had a credit card, which is the Discover card, and they had car insurance, and they were the place to go. Similarly, Kmart in the 1990s was the biggest retailer in America, and Kmart was a great store. They almost were Target-like in terms of having some terrific apparel fashion, some interesting home stuff, and just having a little bit of an edge compared to some other retailers. And these were both good retailers, and through a variety of reasons, they started to decline. Some people say that both Sears and Kmart took their eye off their core businesses as they bought other companies, and I mentioned all the other things that Sears did, and some people criticized them for focusing more on financial services and real estate than on retail, maybe. But I think if they had successfully executed that strategy, that was a brilliant plan. Kmart bought or started a lot of other retail chains. They owned a home improvement one. They owned a warehouse club. They owned two book chains. So they also had a strategy of we're going to have multiple nameplates under one brand. And again, people criticized and said that they then stopped paying attention to Kmart. To me, it's not so clear cut, but clearly both Kmart and Sears declined as core retail businesses, and I'm going to say Sears made the fatal flaw in its retail business. You can trace it back to the 1940s when Sears started to expand into the suburbs. As the baby boom era started and people moved to the suburbs, Sears made a strategic decision to put its stores in shopping malls. Had they put those stores as in strip centers, I think they would have had a very different outcome. This has been my theory. I'm not sure anybody else shares it, but you think about it, the shopping mall customer is not buying lawnmowers and power tools and work clothes and things like that. Those are being bought, today in Home Depot and Lowe's, which are in strip malls or freestanding. So Sears made a big mistake that took 40 years to catch up with them, but it did. Kmart, I think, just stopped investing in their stores. So when Eddie Lampert bought Sears in 2000 and then he bought Kmart in 2005, they were both declining, but both still pretty good businesses. They had about 3,500 stores between the two of them. And there were a lot of opportunities there. They had loyal customers, and Eddie Lampert came along and said, he had a great press agent who said that he was the next Warren Buffett, and he was going to be investing in the businesses, and wasn't going to it was going to be a hands-off owner, and all of that turned out to be absolutely untrue. And his strategy from the very beginning was to pull cash out of that business. It was not to run the businesses. If it had been to run the businesses, we would have seen very different activities. But instead, they kept selling real estate, and it wasn't just real estate. They sold brand names. They stopped investing in their stores. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you look at Sears Kmart's capital expenditure budget versus a Target, and it was a fraction of it. They just weren't spending any money to keep the stores modern and to keep the stores up to date. Both Kmart and Sears had a lot of old stores that needed a lot of work, and they weren't spending it. So, this wasn't just a real estate play to sell off real estate assets. It was to keep spending to a minimum and keep drawing cash out of those businesses that went back to the shareholders, of which Lampert was the biggest shareholder. He had 50% of the company. And there were all kinds of things. The example I've used several times is Sears owned a regional hardware store called Orchard Hardware on the West Coast. And it was a nice little business. They probably should have never bought it, but they did. Somewhere along the line, they sold it to investors for a modest amount of money, and they took the proceeds from the sale and paid out a dividend to Sears shareholders, of which Lampert got half of it. And they then the new owners, and Sears was still a minority owner of it, 49%, I think. And again, excuse me for not having the exact numbers in front of me, but they then took out a line of credit of about $600 million. And and this is my recollection, and I again may not be precise on the numbers. They took that $600 million and issued another special dividend to their shareholders, of which Lampert and ESL Holdings, which is his company, got $300 million of it. And Old Orchard now had $600 million in debt that they didn't have the day before. Within 18 months, Old Orchard filed for bankruptcy and was out of business. So, again, it was a plan to take cash out of it, to send that cash back to shareholders and not to invest in the business. If they had taken out a $600 million credit line and invested it in the stores, that would have been one thing. But that's not what they did. So this is what Lampert kept doing. He sold the big brand names, and so the store count kept diminishing. He took their best stores, their best performing stores, and sold those first, because those were the most valuable assets, and those stores now have Targets in them or Home Depots. So when Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy in 2019, they still had 1,800 stores, which was pretty significant. Lampert convinced the bankruptcy court that he was the best choice for keeping the company going, and they came out of bankruptcy in mid 2019 with 400 stores, and within a year they were down to 197, and now in 2021, and Transformco, which is the company that owns Sears and Kmart now, does not no longer answers questions or talks to anybody about what they're doing. They're a private company, obviously. As best as I can tell, and I talked to some other folks who are following it even more closely than I do, there's about 50 stores left between Sears and Kmart. There may be, I don't know, 30 Sears stores left and 20 Kmarts. And that's it. They're just not a player anymore. So it's a real tragedy. These stores might not have made it under the best of management, based on the competition from Amazon and Walmart. But it didn't have to turn out this way. They could have played a role,
Well, I want to thank Warren for sharing this important story. Now, remember that this is only part one. Listen to part two to hear the rest of what really happened to Sears. And thanks for listening. Please leave a rating or a review on your podcast app. You can learn more about Little Jaunts and our main podcast, En Route, by going to our website, enroutepodcast.org. That's it for this episode. See you for part two. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care and Godspeed. Welcome to Little Jaunts, the sister podcast of En Route. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Well, this is part two of what really happened to Sears. For over a century, Sears was one of the nation's leading retailers. Back in the 1920s, you could literally buy a house from Sears. The post-war years saw Sears booming as it moved into malls across America. Kmart started in 1962, and that was the same year that two other large discount retailers, Target and Walmart, also started their business. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Kmart was the go to place for finding things at a good price, and shoppers were always on the lookout for their famous blue light specials. Over the last decade, hundreds of their stores were closed, and now these two chains are basically defunct. The common story is that Sears and Kmart didn't keep up with the times, and the cause of all of this is the rise of Amazon. Now, the online retail behemoth does have a role in the demise of Sears and Kmart, but it's only a small role. Actually, the reason that these two brands have vanished from the American retail scene is really because of one man, the one time CEO of Sears Holdings, Eddie Lampert. This is the second part of a two-part episode where we will hear from retail analyst Warren Shoulberg, who has followed Lampert and what he did to Sears. Shoulberg is a longtime expert in all things retail, and he is the right person to talk about what really happened to Sears. Now, this is part of a larger interview I did with Shoulberg on retail in general, and that will show up in a few days. But it's important to hear this story about Sears because it is a story about one retailer and what its downfall says about American retail and American society in general. So now let's hear from part two with Warren Shoulberg.
Yep.
Why? I think because I followed this story as well over the years, and the question I always keep having is was anyone able to stop it? Or was this a case that everyone basically was in favor of it? They knew that they were going to get something out of it, some money, and so they just kind of let it happen.
Well, again, Lampert controlled the board of directors, and the board of directors basically rubber stamped his plans. And the shareholders were making money. You know, the Sears stock in the first half of the first decade of the 2000s was a great stock to have. And a lot of people made a lot of money on it. And the decline started later on in the second decade of the 2000s. But as long as people were making money, that was okay. And they weren't doing anything illegal. I don't want to say anything like that. All of this was perfectly legal. As the owners of the company, they could do what they wanted. I think the misunderstanding is anybody who bought into the fact that all of these things were for the benefit of the retail business. I think that's the flaw, is that they were for the benefit of the investors and the owners, and they were to the detriment of ongoing retail businesses. And Lampert tried to sell this. He's a very charming, compelling guy. I spent a half hour with him once, and he was amazingly compelling in trying to convince me why all these things were good. And this was a long time ago. And if you came out of it and said, yeah, okay, I believe in this guy. And but it turns out he just had a different mission. And again, perfectly legal. Well within his rights as the owner of the company to do, and a brilliant strategy if your strategy is to make money.
A while back, I wrote an article, kind of actually comparing Eddie Lampert with former President Trump, and talking about that they were both good at BS, of kind of spinning a story that was believable but wasn't true. I mean, they were saying one thing and actually doing another, but what they were saying was so compelling that you wanted to believe them, to trust them. And I'm just wondering, did you see any connection there? Or
yeah, I certainly wouldn't argue with that. Okay. They're both very good showman, and you know, Trump convinced 75 million Americans that he was the best choice. So he's really good at what he does, and Lampert is very good at what he does, and he's been, anytime anybody was trying to stop him or fight him, he was steps ahead of them, and had it figured out 2 years down the road. So they're both very good. And the link between the two of them is that Trump's what is his Secretary of Commerce, Steve Mnuchin, Commerce,
Treasury.
Treasury. I'm sorry. Yep. Was on the Sears board for a number of years and went to college with Lampert. So I'm not saying that that there was any tie-in beyond that, but it's just an interesting little quirk of history.
One of the other questions that I have was the role of the media in this. Yep. There were stories actually about what was going on. If you read a few, I saw some in like the Washington Post or CNBC or something. I think some of the local Chicago media, since that's where Sears was based. But in general, you didn't hear a whole lot about this story in the media, about what was really happening. And I've always wondered why, because it seems like the story that you would hear from the general story you would hear from the media is that simply Sears didn't keep up with the times.
Yeah.
That wasn't the whole story. And why do you think that the media in general didn't pick up what was going on with Eddie Lampert?
Yeah, it's a great question. Up until the last couple of years, you're absolutely right. He did a great job in getting great press for what he was doing, and the business press bought into it and did not question it. And even when things started to decline, and he was blaming Amazon, they bought into that too. But you think about it. Sears began life as a direct-to-consumer catalog business, and they were in existence, 25 years before they opened their first store. So they had the model in place to continue, to transition it from a print catalog to an online business. And instead, they shut the catalog down. And I look at Penny. Penny did the same thing. That they, so Sears wasn't the only one. Penny had a great heritage of selling direct to consumer, and it's a tragedy that they weren't able to transition that. Compare that to, again, and I know I've gotten off tangent and I'll come back to you in a second. Compare that to who I mentioned before, Williams Sonoma, which also had a heritage of selling direct through their catalog, and they were smart enough to transition that to selling online, and they were brilliant at it, and they still are. Sears and Penny's were not. So the business press, I think, just and the general press just did not do their homework, and it's disappointing as a member of the press. It's not our finest moment. I will sound self-serving, but I have been. But I think I've been able to see through the Sears Kmart thing for a very long time, and it infuriated me when other media continued to drink the Kool-Aid and to buy what he was doing. So I don't know what the answer is, except they just didn't do their homework.
What do you think is going to be the result in retail of the loss of these two retailers, and what Lampert was able to do?
So, first off, the Sears and Kmart names are going to live on in one form or another. When the current company eventually goes out of business, somebody will buy the Kmart name and they'll resurrected in some form, and somebody will buy Sears name and resurrect it in some form. So those brands are going to stick around. As retail businesses, they're already gone. They're, with so few stores left, they're just not a factor at all, and they haven't been for 2 or 3 years. So the damage is already done. There's no more market share to divide up. Who's ever already taken it, whoever was going to take it has already taken it. So certainly Walmart and Target got a big chunk of it. Kohl's got some of it. The dollar stores got some of it. Yeah, the impact's has already happened, and I don't think when they go out with the final whimper, no one's even going to notice. But there will be sad stories about the demise of these guys, and they've been dead for years. Just no one's had the heart to tell them.
So when you say that I do agree, I think the brands will survive in some form. Do you think that would be restarting the business, or doing like, Montgomery Ward, which has someone bought the name and has a website and all of that?
Yeah, it'll probably be the Montgomery Ward model, and that's who I was going to cite also. Just it'll be an online business. They'll talk about opening stores. You look at Toys R Us, and somebody bought the intellectual properties and said they were going to start online and they were going to open stores, and they did open, I think, 3 stores, and they were very different model. And whether they would have worked or not, we don't know, because they went under during the pandemic. But somebody will buy them. They'll talk about stores. If the stores open, I'll be shocked. And there'll be online businesses. There's still a Sears hometown operation, which also Eddie Lampert now owns, and they have a couple of 100 stores, and these are kind of franchises. They're an odd mix of stuff, and they sell lawnmowers and appliances and some other odds and ends and repair stuff. They'll stick around for a while. Sears Auto, I think, still has some viability. Somebody will buy that. I've been shocked he has not been able to sell that so far. But I think so. We'll see Sears Auto stores, and Kmart, probably not. Probably as an online business. But don't be surprised if somebody starts opening dollar format stores under the Kmart name. I mean, that's the scenario I see as if anything's going to work, it's going to be something like that. But big 100,000 square foot stores, no.
Well, I am extremely thankful for Warren for sharing this important story of what really happened to Sears. And I hope that you enjoyed both part 1 and part 2. I want to thank you for listening. Please leave a rating or a review on your podcast app. You can learn more about Little Jaunts and the main podcast, En route, by going to our website at enroutepodcast.org. That's it for this episode. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care and Godspeed.